So let's talk, because I know you don't have that much time either. I want to talk about China. And the Republicans and Democrats are split on China. The Democrats seem to be, and it's all, the whole thing is kind of incoherent and opaque. But the Democrats seem to be, wanting to be super friendly to China, and the Goldman Sachs people who have invested, Microsoft is really at this point a Chinese company. Its whole research division in China is utterly dependent on China for its survival and cannot survive if China cuts it off. And so you have a lot of the tech people who are pro-democratic or tend to be Democrat, who are kind of almost have blinders on about the adversarial posture that Republicans believe China is in. My take is, which is kind of an amateur take, but we should not be de-escalating. We are going to have to compete with the Chinese on some landscape, and it's better to compete with them on an economic landscape than it is on a military landscape. And that China does not want to go to war with us. It does not want to have World War III in Taiwan. And that our military response to all of their kind of expansion and their ambitions, their muscle flexing, is heading us in that direction, which would be a calamity for the globe. And I'm not scared about competing with the Chinese head to head on economics. And to me, that's where we should be headed. So let's hear what you have to say about that.
I'm on a very cooperation end on all the China issues, and let me explain why. First, I've been going to China now for 42 years, a lot. I started in 1981, just after the end of the Cultural Revolution, and Deng Xiaoping had just come to power. China was impoverished, and I saw China in its impoverished condition. And I've been going frequently since then for 4 decades. And China has developed with tremendous success through an incredible amount of hard work, high saving, smart policies, and catching up, basically. And to my take, and I've studied this now really in depth for a long time, there's a view in the US, which I think is a deeply wrong view, which is, well, they must have cheated to do what they did. And I do not think that is right. They're very smart, industrious, hardworking, high saving, and they basically followed a model of rapid industrialization that Japan had pioneered actually at the end of the 19th century, and then after World War II, when everything was destroyed, Japan did it again 25 years ahead of China starting. So I'm impressed. Now, I have to also say I've trained dozens of Chinese students who are now in senior levels of government or the industry and so forth. I liked them when they were my students. I like them now. I have personal relations of very friendly and extensive professional relations. And it's all normal to me that this is not an enemy. This is a country that was poor. It's now still, by US standards, way behind the United States in per capita income. So this is not a rich country. It's probably about 1/3 of the US per person income. But the population's large, so it's 4 times larger than the US. So that means that the overall size of the economy, by one kind of measure called purchasing power parity, they're bigger. By another kind of measure, market prices, they're smaller. But they're not rich. They're still developing. And then I've written a lot of books about their history and studied it. And the basic point, Bobby, is that, for hundreds of years, China was great world leader, but that goes back 1,000 years ago. And the Sung dynasty was really impressive 1,000 years ago. Then China was invaded by the Mongols, and I won't go through 1,000 years of history except to say that famously they had a great fleet in the early 1400s that basically unbelievably toured the Indian Ocean all the way to East Africa, to India, to all the ports of the Indian Ocean. And then in 1434, and probably the worst policy move in the history of world economy, and I'll put it that way, they closed up the fleet. They said, we're not so interested in trade. We're pretty self-sufficient. And while they never closed entirely, China basically gave up its leadership, say in naval capacity and so forth, and turned mostly inward. It's a long, complicated story. I won't go into it in detail. By the early 19th century, China had really fallen behind because Britain had an industrial revolution, which started with the steam engine, and all of that went into the military early on with turning the Navy to steamers and so on. In 1839, Britain invaded China. We call it the First Opium War, probably the most cynical, nasty, particular cause of war in modern times, perhaps, which was that Britain demanded that China accept opium from British merchants at a time when the Chinese leaders knew that the opium addiction was a really serious addiction. So there was a first opium war, there was a second opium war, there was a Taiping rebellion, there were the unequal treaties, there was the Boxer Rebellion, there was the Chinese Revolution in 1910, there was civil war, then there was the Japanese invasion. And I go through all of this to say there was a hellish 110 years, hellish, from Britain invading to 1949, when the modern state, the People's Republic of China, was established. And they call that the century of humiliation. What it means from an economic point of view is they went from being a very advanced and, of course, esteemed civilization to being completely impoverished by invasion after invasion, humiliation after humiliation, which was the fact because all the imperial powers, including the United States, in the early years of the 20th century, abused China incredibly. And then Japan really was nasty. And this is another long story, but Japan actually invaded China several times, already back in 1895 in the Sino-Japanese War, and then really invaded 1931, taking over Manchuria, 1937 with the Nanjing massacre, and then open war. So the Chinese have the view, hell, we don't want that to happen again. We don't want to be dismembered. We don't want to fall under colonial rule. We don't want to be impoverished again. We need to stand on our feet again. And really, since Deng Xiaoping came to power in 1978, China opened to the world. China has been peaceful and focused on economics. And the economics that China's been focused on is catching up. So it's not nefarious, it's not evil, it's the kind of rapid industrialization that Japan invented actually in 1868, something called the Meiji Restoration, and again in the 1950s and 1960s. And a lot of what happened with Deng Xiaoping starting in 1978 was literally learned from Japanese, because the Japanese engineers went over and helped China to retool, helped them to build a new industry, and so on. Now, as an economist, I look at this and say, my God, even from a very poor income level, they were saving 40 or 50% of their national income. They were investing. They went from mass illiteracy and very little education to incredible building up of skills and knowledge base and hundreds of thousands of STEM PhDs per year. And I've been seeing this with my own eyes year after year after year after year. So my view is there's no reason for conflict, none whatsoever. And in the last 40 years, when the US has been in nonstop wars, I'm sorry to say, China has not been involved in one war. And they had one brief war that was around the Khmer Rouge Vietnam issue in the late 1970s. Otherwise, they've been a victim of wars for 200 years and have launched none. One short war in 1979 involving Vietnam and Cambodia because of the Khmer Rouge and Cambodia, and it was very short-lived. Other than that, none. And we keep accusing them of you're belligerent, and we have surrounded them with the military. We've surrounded them with bases. We outspend them still 3-1 on the military. If we sat down with them, it would really, really make a difference. And I have to tell you, Bobby, one of my star students from about 30 years ago is now one of the top academics in China. Wonderful person. And we were at a meeting a few years ago. It was Chinese and Americans and some others. And we were talking about why everything is broken down. And he said something deep and hilarious. He said, you guys, he looked around to the whole room, you just don't understand. And I've been part of the American world. I have an American PhD from Harvard. Here's my advice, he said. The Chinese want one thing, respect. The Americans want one thing, to be told how smart they are. If each side would just do what they should do vis-a-vis the other, believe me, everybody's going to get along just fine. Okay, it's a clever remark, but there's a depth to it as well. And when the Biden administration came in, I had a lot of friends, have a lot of friends, a lot of former friends, I'm afraid, but a lot of friends in the administration and senior reaches. And I said, reach out to China. And you know what? The order came from the White House, no discussions with China during the first year because we're reassessing. Biden came out swinging when they had that first meeting in Anchorage, Alaska. It was like, nice to meet you. What about Hong Kong? What about Xinjiang? What about Taiwan? In other words, put the thumb in the eye of the other side publicly and aggressively from the start. What's Nancy Pelosi doing flying to Taiwan? Don't provoke. If you know the history, don't provoke. Talk, discuss, debate, disagree, negotiate. All of that's fine. But why we're provoking is something I find irresponsible and really dangerous and unnecessary. And we will walk into a war the way we're going, just like we did with Ukraine. And our diplomats told us the war with Ukraine is going to come if we continue on the path that we're going. And I'm telling you, if we continue on the path that we're going in our rhetoric in Taiwan and the arming of Taiwan and all the rest, it's no favor to Taiwan. All we're doing is taking steps towards a complete breakdown of trust that will lead to disaster if we don't understand how to avoid that.
So what do you make of what happened with Saudi Arabia and Iran, with the Chinese brokering that peace?
The Chinese have a growing reach in the world because they're the lead trade partner of probably half the world at this point. And they buy a lot of oil from the Middle East. They have good relations with Iran and Saudi Arabia. And they really don't want war. They don't want war in Taiwan. They don't want war in East Asia. They don't want war in Ukraine, by the way, and I know it. And I had long discussions in Beijing a couple of months ago about the Ukraine war. They don't want this instability. What they want is to continue to have economic development. And so I think that their foreign policy is pretty darn serious, which is it is based on economics. It's based on what we used to do, and we did it a lot, and we did it to good effect, which was helping to build infrastructure, helping American businesses to have a positive role in places to be a base for economic development. Well, China's doing that exactly right now. And we view that as, oh my God, look at how horrible. But it's not horrible. It's just smart. You know, they've grown. They are major trade partners. So they're doing things that are to their benefit, but not to the disadvantage of the other countries. They believe actually that that cooperation and win-win makes a lot of sense for them. And I think they're being proved right because most of the world is not falling into line with the United States right now. Most of the world is looking at, say, the Ukraine war and saying, why don't you negotiate this? And why is NATO enlargement so vital when Russia said don't do it? And most of the world's looking at the Taiwan issue and saying, maybe calm down. Don't just have an arms race there. And so I think the Chinese are very successful diplomatically, except in what we call the Western world, which, by the way, is now, you can define it pretty precisely. It's the US, Canada, UK, European Union, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and Singapore. That's the part that's on side on Ukraine. That's the part that the US gets into line on all of these issues. But you know what? The population of that group is probably about 12 to 15% of the world population. And the rest of the world's looking on and saying, we're not quite in line with that. And we tell ourselves, oh, we're leading the world, but not really. What we're leading is a pretty small part of the world population that doesn't buy into expanded military alliances and so forth, that basically wants economic development. So competing on economic development, great. Competing on who can help different region of the world to develop or to have green energy, great. But let's do that. That's a race to the top, not a race to a new nuclear arms race and so forth. And we keep saying, look, China's building up its military. We are 3 times the military spending of China. So if we're concerned about that, let's sit down and negotiate so that we don't have an arms race between the two. China doesn't want an arms race. China wants economic development.
How about, you didn't talk about, in that kind of litany of the countries describing our cohort, you didn't talk about where traditionally Latin America was in the American sphere of influence. Is that changing too?
Yeah, President Lula is, first of all, quite outspoken, saying we need a negotiated peace in Ukraine. And he, of course, was recently in China, and he said it in China, and our press reported, how dare he say these things? And how dare he talk about NATO expansion as being provocative and so forth? But this is the Latin American view. And I was with another president of a major Latin American country a few months ago. I won't put that person on the spot. But the first words when we sat down was from the president, this is about NATO. What is this enlargement thing? Why is this being pushed so much? That's again I didn't provoke it. That's what the president said to me first thing. That is a widespread view. And remember, we've not exactly been helpful in the Latin American context in recent years. There was an active attempt to overthrow the Venezuelan president, not even subtle. I mean, it was admitted, acknowledged. At one point, Trump, in what I regarded as almost a comic book approach, except it's tragic, just said, okay, Maduro's no longer president. Now Juan Guaido is president. We picked a president. We just said, no, we're going to call that one president, not this one president. We put on sanctions to break the Venezuelan economy, which our sanctions actually did. And I was in the Americas quite often during this period, and the presidents were saying to me, you're breaking the region. You're dividing the region in two. We can't cooperate. Of course, we have to go along with the White House. They can squeeze the hell out of us. They can stop us from getting loans from the Inter-American Development Bank or from the Latin American Development Fund. So we go along, but we can't even talk to our neighbor because they're on the other side of this thing. So this is really a strong feeling. It's crazy. It's so unnecessary. We shouldn't declare that someone else is president than the actual president of a country. It's a bad habit. It's a kind of arrogance that never works out. And on all of these things, I have to say, just watching them for so many years and so many decades, when we froze the accounts of Venezuela, said, you can't have your own money anymore, And then we said Maduro is no longer president, Guaido is president. And by the way, then some Harvard economists and some MIT economists said, yeah, now we're going to help the new administration of Guaido. I thought, this is ridiculous. This absolutely is going to end bad. And of course, it ended almost like a farce, except for Venezuela, which has been devastated economically. But Maduro is there. Now we run to him to say, you got to pump more oil to replace the Russian oil that we're taking off the market, because they're not thinking. And the main point is, God, stop being so arrogant in this US, because this is where you keep stepping into problems, thinking you can do whatever you want, even when the other country is saying, please don't do that. Just give us some space, or don't overthrow us, or don't seize our assets. But there's an arrogance that really is bad. I went back, by the way, and read a book that I vaguely remembered from high school. And I read it last weekend. It's almost 60 years old. J. William Fulbright, The Arrogance of Power.
Remember that book?
Unbelievable. I remembered it too. And for more than a half a century, I hadn't looked at it. And I went back and I read it this weekend, and you could read it as if it was talking about today. And basically, Fulbright, who was the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and of course, where the Fulbright scholarships came from, originated, was saying we keep getting into trouble because we can't listen to the other side. And he has a whole riff about how good neutrality can be, and that sometimes you don't want to push NATO, or you don't want to push your side. It's actually literally there in the 1960s, saying if we would let some of these countries be neutral, the Soviet Union would go home, we would go home, and we'd leave these countries in the middle in peace. And he cites Austria, which I've come to know this year very well because I've been spending some of my sabbatical there. In 1955, Austria declared neutrality. The Soviet Union, which had occupied part of Austria after World War II, sent the troops home, and Austria became a neutral, incredibly successful, peaceful country, never bothered again at all by the Soviet Union because it was neutral. And that was a model. That's the model for Ukraine, by the way. That's the model that George Kennan kept saying. Give some space so that we're not putting our nose right up against the other guy, not provoking. And it's a model that we don't learn, because you have to tone down the arrogance a little bit to learn to give some space. So I think it comes back over and over again to that.